Police ignores a disabled man, not realizing he's a general on an undercover mission. It was a bitter morning in downtown Chicago, the kind that clawed through coats and sliced past gloves. Wind roared through the alleyways like a warning no one listened to. The streets were busy, full of people hurrying to where warmth waited. Cars splashed through puddles from last night's storm. On the corner of 15th and Halsted, a man sat slumped in a rusted wheelchair. His coat was thin. His hands trembled not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something older. His name was Daniel. No one stopped. Some glanced with pity, others with disgust, but mostly he was invisible. One cop walked past him with a cup of coffee, glanced down, said nothing. The other officer laughed quietly as they crossed the street. Nothing about him screamed importance. He looked like another forgotten soul. Cracks of Light. That's the name of this channel. Stories that dig through darkness to show you the fire that still burns in people who've been pushed aside. And if you're watching this right now, we'd be grateful if you subscribed. Every story we bring you comes with a cost of time, effort, heart. Your support helps us bring more truth to light. Now back to Daniel. He wasn't always like this. But this part of the story isn't about who he was. Not yet. That truth needs to wait. For now, you need to see what the world saw. Just another crippled man on the street. The truth would come later, but not before he was broken a little more. The two officers returned, this time responding to a call about a minor theft nearby. They saw Daniel again, still sitting there, motionless. One of them, Officer Jenkins, frowned and walked up to him. "You've been sitting here all morning?" Daniel didn't respond, just looked up. Calm eyes, steady breath. "Do you need medical help, or are you just hanging out?" the officer asked, sarcastic. His partner chuckled from behind. "Maybe you want a donut." The other cop leaned forward. "Sir, I asked you a question." Daniel blinked slowly and finally spoke. His voice was steady, almost too steady. "I'm waiting for someone." Jenkins scoffed. "Well, you can't just sit here and take up space. You're blocking the path." Daniel didn't move. "Then you should call someone," he said. Jenkins narrowed his eyes. "Are you being a smartass?" The words echoed like an insult. Jenkins stepped forward, but his partner tugged his arm. "Leave him. Just another crazy. We got better things to do." They walked off, leaving Daniel alone. Again. But what they didn't notice was the black car parked across the street. Windows tinted, engine running. Inside, a man in a suit watched closely. He spoke into a small mic hidden in his collar. Visual confirmed. He made contact with local PD. Level 1 reaction consistent. Proceeding to Phase 2. The voice was calm, precise. The man wasn't looking at Daniel like the cops had. There was something deeper in his eyes. Respect. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't move, just adjusted the glove on his left hand. The glove was military-grade leather, warm but clean, deliberate, a detail that didn't match the rest of his worn-down appearance. Another hour passed. A woman approached him, early 30s, black hoodie, nervous. She handed him a small envelope and whispered something before walking away quickly. He slid the envelope inside his jacket. Another car passed, then another. Two teenagers threw a bottle near his chair. Laughed. No one said a word. Daniel didn't react, didn't flinch. His hands remained steady on the wheels of his chair. But inside that calm was a storm. Not anger. Focus. You see, Daniel wasn't just waiting. He was watching, calculating. Every person who passed, every detail of the block, every movement of the patrol cars. He was on mission, but no one could tell. That was the point. Across town, inside a dimly lit operations room at Fort Sheridan, three men stared at a screen showing Daniel's live feed. One of them, Colonel Mason, muttered under his breath, "Jesus, he's really doing it. That bastard still got it." A second man, much younger, shook his head. "But why put him out there? He's a 4-star general. He's been out of the field for over a decade." Mason leaned forward. "Because no one would ever suspect him. That's exactly why." Back on the street, Daniel noticed a small van parked where it shouldn't be. No plates. Two men inside. No movement. His eyes locked on them for 3 seconds. Just enough. Then back to stillness. Still playing the role. Still invisible. But inside his jacket, a signal had already been sent. And while everyone saw weakness, Daniel had already begun to move the pieces. The mission wasn't about him. It was about exposure, corruption in a local department, illegal trafficking under the noses of authorities, a leak inside military command. And the only way to get close was to be no one. Be less than no one. Be a man in a wheelchair. Be overlooked. Officer Jenkins came back again that afternoon. More aggressive this time. "You're still here?" he snapped. "I told you this morning, you need to move." Daniel looked up again. Same calm. Same patience. "I told you. I'm waiting for someone." Jenkins stepped closer. "You think this is funny? People like you need to be in shelters or hospitals. Not out here making people uncomfortable." Still, Daniel didn't move. Jenkins grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. Daniel's hand shot up. Fast. Firm. "Don't," he said. The officer froze. The voice. It had changed. Gone was the quiet tone of helplessness. This was a command. Pure, unmistakable command. Jenkins hesitated, then laughed awkwardly. "You threatening me, old man?" He stepped away, muttering to himself. But he felt it. Something wasn't right. The look in Daniel's eyes. The stillness. The authority. It didn't make sense. The way some men walk into a room and take control without raising their voice. That kind of presence. Jenkins would remember it later. Regret it. But not yet. The day dragged on. More people passed. A few dropped coins. One little girl gave him a chocolate bar. Daniel smiled. Genuinely. "Thank you," he said. Her mother yanked her away before she could respond. The sun dipped behind the skyscrapers. The temperature dropped again. But Daniel stayed. Waiting. Watching. And miles away, the operation moved into its next phase. But here on this corner, no one knew. They still thought he was just another forgotten man. Just another burden. But that illusion wouldn't last forever. The twist was coming. But first, he had to let them push him a little further. The streetlights flickered on with a hollow buzz as darkness fell over the city like a heavy curtain. Daniel adjusted his posture ever so slightly, enough to relieve pressure from his lower spine, but subtle enough that no one watching would notice the motion. Behind his stillness was a discipline honed through decades of field work, of silence, of waiting. The cold bit deeper now, nipping at the corners of his neck and crawling inside his sleeves. He didn't shiver, not even when the wind whipped harder. At 6:42 p.m., a man in a black hoodie approached from the north sidewalk. He moved slowly, pausing near the corner trash can, then casually strolled past Daniel. A slip of paper fluttered from his sleeve, landed just near the wheelchair's front wheel. Daniel didn't look down, didn't react. Not until the man was gone and the paper had rested still for exactly 5 seconds. He picked it up slowly, as if examining trash, and tucked it into his coat. Inside Fort Sheridan, analysts monitored every movement. Colonel Mason stood behind the team, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "That's the third drop," one of the techs said. "Still no counter-surveillance movement. They're not onto him." "They won't be," Mason replied. "Not unless someone gets stupid." Back on the street, the tension thickened. A black sedan rolled by slowly. Tinted windows. No plates. It circled the block. Once. Twice. Daniel counted the rotations without turning his head. His left thumb tapped against the armrest of the wheelchair, 3 short taps, then 2 long ones. A pattern. Morse code. It activated a micro beacon hidden beneath the seat. The signal bounced to a drone flying high above the city, then relayed to command. Eyes were everywhere, but only Daniel was in the open. A target in a trap. Just before 7 p.m., Officer Jenkins returned again, this time alone. His posture more aggressive, his patience worn thin by a day of minor calls and the gnawing frustration of a man with something to prove. "You really still here?" he spat, stepping right into Daniel's space. "You think this is some kind of joke? You people always playing the pity game, sitting around waiting for handouts. You want to be a statue, huh?" Jenkins kicked at the wheel gently. Not enough to cause damage, just enough to make a point. Daniel looked up at him, his eyes calm, but different now. A storm was behind them. Jenkins saw it for a split second, then dismissed it. "Let me tell you something, buddy. I could write you up. Loitering. Obstruction. Hell, I could call a unit to move you out of here." Daniel didn't flinch. "Then do it," he said quietly. The cop blinked. Something about the way he said it. Not like a dare. Like a challenge from someone who'd seen men try to intimidate him before and had buried them with nothing more than silence. Jenkins hesitated, then pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 2 to 4. I've got an uncooperative subject at the corner of Halstead and 15th. Possible mental health issue. Requesting a unit for transport. Static crackled for a moment. Then a voice replied, copy that 2 to 4. Unit 3 to 1 is en route ETA 5 minutes. Jenkins smirked. See that? 5 minutes and you're out of here. Daniel didn't respond. Inside, his heart was steady. He knew what came next. He had planned for it. Across the street, the black sedan returned. This time it stopped. One rear door, cracked open just an inch. A camera lens extended silently from a gap, capturing everything. Jenkins didn't notice. He was too focused on asserting control. You got ID? He asked. Name, anything? Daniel shook his head. No ID. Jenkins stepped back, radioing again. Subject has no ID. Appears homeless. Claims to be waiting for someone, but refuses to move. A short pause. Then dispatch replied, copy. Transport team advised to proceed with caution. Caution. That word caught Jenkins off guard. He looked down at Daniel again. Something was wrong here. The man's eyes were too sharp. His posture too deliberate. He looked like someone who had seen war. And not just seen it. Commanded it. Led it. Jenkins cleared his throat. You know what? Maybe I'll just wait for the transport team. He stepped back slightly, uncertain now. It was the first crack in his facade. Daniel stared ahead, not at Jenkins, but at the van across the street. Inside, the two men were no longer just watching. One of them lifted a phone, made a call. It connected to an unlisted number inside a government server. He made contact with a hostile officer again, the man said. Reaction recorded. Transmission complete. Silence on the other end. Then a voice spoke. Phase 3 cleared. Proceed with local test on target 2. The van moved off quietly. Meanwhile, across town, inside a warehouse lit only by overhead fluorescence, a group of armed men huddled around crates. Guns, chemicals, documents with government seals. This was what Daniel had come to expose. Not just the street-level cruelty, but the rot at the core. People being trafficked, weapons disappearing from evidence lockers, officers paid to look the other way, and all of it connected to someone in uniform. High up, possibly inside Fort Sheridan itself. Daniel had volunteered for this mission because he had to see it from the bottom up. Feel the cold, smell the streets, taste the dismissal. It wasn't enough to read reports. He needed to look it in the eyes, just like Jenkins was doing now. The transport unit arrived. 2 officers stepped out, one young and cautious, the other older, jaded. They approached Daniel slowly. Sir, we're going to take you to a shelter where you can get help, all right? One of them said gently. Daniel turned to look at him. This time he smiled. Not mockingly, calmly. I'm exactly where I need to be, he said. The officer frowned. Sir, we need you to come with us. Daniel leaned forward just a bit. Whispered something only the older officer could hear. The man stiffened. His eyes widened. What did you say? He asked. Daniel repeated it. A call sign. One that hadn't been used publicly in over 15 years. The kind known only to high-level military command. The man stepped back instinctively. He looked at Jenkins, then at his partner. Step back, he ordered. We're not transporting him. What? Why? The younger one asked. Because he outranks everyone on this block, the man said under his breath. Jenkins laughed nervously. What are you talking about? But no one answered. Because the moment of revelation had begun. Quiet. Subtle. The shift in air when truth starts bleeding through the cracks of assumption. Daniel remained seated. Silent. Still. But the world around him had begun to move differently. The shadows had started to retreat. The first thread of his true identity had been pulled. And everything that followed would unravel the lie they all believed. The man they thought was weak was never weak. He was patience made flesh. He was justice in disguise. He was the storm that had been waiting for permission to rise. The silence between the officers grew heavy as the weight of Daniel's words began to settle. The older officer, Sergeant Raymond, had seen a lot in his 23 years of service. He had met dignitaries, witnessed corruption, and even stood post during presidential security details, but nothing had ever made his spine stiffen like hearing that call sign. It wasn't just a name. It was a classified designation, a direct link to Special Command, issued only to active generals operating beyond borders and beyond paperwork. He took one more look at Daniel, trying to reconcile the shivering man in the battered wheelchair with the reputation that name carried in the hidden corners of the military world. Jenkins scoffed again, trying to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "You all acting like this guy's a ghost or something." Sergeant Raymond didn't respond. He stepped closer to Daniel, then turned slightly and positioned himself between Jenkins and the chair. "You've done enough," Raymond said to him, eyes locked, voice firm. "Step back." Jenkins hesitated, but the tone left no room for debate. Daniel gave a small nod, not in gratitude, but in quiet acknowledgement of proper protocol. That nod said everything. Raymond looked back at him and whispered low enough so no one else could hear. "Do we need to initiate containment procedures?" Daniel's reply was soft. "Not yet, but you'll know when." Behind them, traffic kept moving, lights passing like ghosts over cracked sidewalks. Above them, drones shifted positions, camera lenses adjusting angles. The black sedan had returned again, parked further down now, headlights off, engine idling low. Inside, the man in the suit received an encrypted message. The words were brief. "Phase 3 compromised. Proceed with controlled exposure." He typed back one word. "Understood." The operation was no longer covert. It was about to become a statement. At exactly 7:14 p.m., a loud crack echoed from across the street. The sound of a tire bursting. Then another. It came from the warehouse Daniel had been tracking through scattered intel and street-level drops. The crates. The trafficking. The dirty chain that tied everything together. A controlled detonation. Not big enough to draw federal attention, but just enough to force local patrol units to respond. To shift focus. To create chaos. Jenkins looked around. What the hell was that? But Raymond was already calling in. Daniel sat still, listening, feeling the rhythm change. This was the pivot point. This was the moment the mission either succeeded or failed. The transport unit hesitated, unsure of their next move, caught between orders and uncertainty. Daniel reached in his coat and pulled out a thin black badge. The kind almost no one ever saw. It had no name, just a symbol, a crest. Golden wings encircling a triangle. Raymond inhaled sharply. The younger officer stepped back like he had seen a ghost. Daniel looked at them both. "From this point forward, I am no longer a civilian under your jurisdiction. I am operating under Article 17. You will maintain a perimeter within visual range, but you will not interfere unless I signal. Am I understood?" Raymond nodded instantly. The younger officer stammered, but nodded too. Jenkins stepped forward, anger rising. "What is this? Some fake badge scam? You're all falling for this." Daniel turned slowly toward him, and for the first time that day, his posture changed. He sat taller, straighter. His eyes no longer pleaded for understanding. They commanded it. "Officer Jenkins," he said, voice calm but edged like steel, "as of this moment, every action you've taken today is under review by federal oversight. If you continue to interfere, your badge will be revoked, and your career will end before the sun rises. Stand down." Jenkins opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out, because in that voice, in that authority, in that absolute certainty, there was no room for ego, no space for pride, only the cold realization that he had severely underestimated the man in front of him. He stepped back, silent now, almost pale. Across town, unmarked teams raided the edges of the warehouse. No sirens, no lights, silent ops, black tactical gear, heat sensors. The names of people being held inside would later be classified. Women, children, veterans, all victims of the same system Daniel had returned to dismantle. But this wasn't the end. This was just the tip of something deeper. A signal buzzed in Daniel's ear, nearly silent. The voice of Colonel Mason came through. "Target confirmed. But there's been movement at the top. The leak is closer than we thought." Daniel responded without moving his lips. "How close?" A pause. Then Mason's voice again. "Command level. Possibly joint task force. We need eyes inside before we move. Daniel's jaw tightened. That meant betrayal from someone who'd worn the same stars he did. Someone trusted. Someone dangerous. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the city breathe. Inhale. Exhale. He knew what had to come next. Visibility. Make himself seen. Draw them out. Across the street, a reporter had started to arrive near the scene of the tire explosion. Local news always trailed behind chaos. Daniel looked toward the transport team. Clear the path. I'll move forward on my own. Raymond stepped aside. Daniel began to roll forward. Slowly, every push of the wheels deliberate. The street opened in front of him like a stage. The lights, the noise, the watchers, all shifting now. His role no longer hidden. The general was stepping into the open, but not for praise, not for glory, for confrontation, for truth, for accountability. The man they dismissed, ignored, and mocked was now the axis upon which the next 24 hours would spin. Every camera would see him. Every whisper would lead to him. And the people who thought they had buried their secrets in shadows were about to face the man who'd walked through darker places and come back to bring the light. The sound of Daniel's wheels moving along the uneven sidewalk cut through the static of street noise like a quiet metronome counting down to something none of them could name. The transport officers watched him go, unsure if they had just witnessed a man stepping out of disguise or stepping into war. Sergeant Raymond said nothing but tapped his radio once, signaling to Central Command that visual contact was stable. The black sedan trailed at a slow distance now, following without headlights, ghost-like in its silence. Inside, the man in the suit opened a hard case file, inside which were still images of Daniel taken over the last 48 hours, photos of the warehouse, the corrupt officers he had tracked, the woman in the hoodie, the drop points, all connected by red markings and handwritten notes. At the top of the file, circled in ink, were the words Level 7 Clearance, Eyes Only. Daniel crossed Halstead and turned onto a narrower side street, the kind with broken lights and damp shadows, and too many corners that made people nervous at night. But he rolled forward calmly, his hand gently brushing a sensor just under his coat, transmitting a location pulse to the surveillance net overhead. He wasn't alone out here, even if it looked like he was. The Real Army moved silently. As he passed a shuttered diner, a boy no older than 10 peeked out from behind a parked car. Dirty coat, empty eyes, the look of a child who had already learned to stop asking for help. Daniel slowed and reached into his coat, pulled out a protein bar, handed it wordlessly. The boy hesitated, then took it. Their eyes met for only a second, but it said everything. This was why he had come back. Not just to expose the corrupt, but to remember what justice looked like when it was small and fragile and ignored. Behind him, a camera clicked. Across the street, a freelance photojournalist crouched behind a garbage bin. Lens pointed directly at Daniel. He had caught the badge flash earlier, had seen the officer step back, and he smelled a story that didn't belong to the usual headlines. He snapped 2 more photos, then sent a message to his editor. Unknown high-ranking, official undercover on the streets. Possible federal sting. Recommend immediate coverage. Back at the precinct, Jenkins sat at his desk, staring at his body cam footage. His hand trembled as he rewound the moment Daniel spoke the call sign, then paused, then played it again. Each time, his face looked worse, paler, more unsure. He had mocked a general, had threatened him, had put hands on his wheelchair. His career wasn't just in danger. It was already over. He reached for his phone, started typing a message to Internal Affairs, then deleted it. Then typed it again. The fear wasn't just from the power Daniel held. It was from knowing deep down he had done what so many others had done. Judged based on surface. Dismissed without care. And now the world might see it. And not just see it. Record it. Replay it. He turned off the monitor and buried his head in his hands. Downtown, Daniel reached the warehouse's rear side, the one entrance not covered in caution tape. The tactical team had already cleared the inside, neutralized all active threats, but the structure was now being left untouched, a crime scene locked from public access. Daniel rolled up to the steel door, looked directly at the security camera mounted above, and said one word. Access. The door buzzed. Unlocked. He rolled inside. The air was damp and cold, full of chemicals and mold and silence. Lights flickered overhead. Inside, crates still lay half open, revealing their contents. Boxes of prescription medication labeled for military hospitals but reported missing months ago. Stolen tactical gear, IDs, and worse, folders of names. People trafficked from abroad, promised jobs, funneled through the very system built to protect them, then sold or lost into the dark. Daniel moved from crate to crate, memorizing the layouts, the placement, the evidence. His mind was a catalog now, a machine. He didn't need time. He needed precision. From the far end of the warehouse, a door opened. Not SWAT, not backup. A man in a civilian coat stepped in slowly. Mid-50s, balding, confident, a quiet kind of dangerous. His name was Leonard Rusk, Deputy Director of Internal Command Investigations. Technically Daniel's superior. Officially not even supposed to be in Chicago. Rusk looked around, then at Daniel. "You should have stayed buried," he said calmly. Daniel didn't blink. "You should have stayed loyal." Rusk sighed. "We gave you every out. Retirement. Silence. Respect. But you had to come back in a wheelchair like some ghost out of a war story." Daniel rolled forward slightly. "The ghosts are the ones you left behind in these boxes. I'm just the voice." Rusk stepped closer, pulling a small pistol from inside his coat. Not aiming, just holding. "You know I can make you disappear again. This time for good." Daniel's voice didn't waver. "You'd have done it already if you weren't scared of who's watching. You know they're watching. You know this warehouse is already tagged for public review. Body cams, drones, witnesses. There's no unmaking this." Rusk's hand twitched but didn't raise the gun. "You're still betting on honor, Daniel. That's your weakness." Daniel smiled faintly. "No, I'm betting on exposure." "Which is your weakness?" Outside, the photojournalist's images were already on Twitter. The man in the wheelchair. The officers backing off. The badge. It was spreading fast, and the hashtag that followed was even faster. The general in the streets. The tide was turning. Slowly, deliberately, just like Daniel had planned. Rusk lowered the gun and turned to leave. "You win this round, but there are still people above both of us. They'll never let this stick." Daniel's reply was quiet. "Then I'll just keep rolling forward. One block at a time." Rusk vanished into the shadows. Daniel remained still, alone again, surrounded by the truth he had risked everything to expose. But this time he wasn't invisible. The world was watching now. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the only one who believed justice was worth chasing. The morning after was not quiet. The first wave of news hit just after 6 a.m. A still image of Daniel in his wheelchair flanked by 2 officers, with a blurred backdrop of patrol cars and city fog. The headline was vague but enough to spark curiosity. High-ranking military official spotted in civilian disguise during police encounter. The photojournalist had done his job. The image flooded social media within an hour, and by mid-morning, the hashtag "The General in the Streets" was trending across platforms. At first, the public didn't know who he was. Just a man in a wheelchair, commanding quiet authority, facing off against a street cop. But the body cam footage leaked next. Not by accident. The clip where Daniel spoke the call sign, where the older officer stepped back in shock, where Jenkins looked like a child caught in a lie. 27 seconds that shattered the illusion. People didn't need to know his full name to know what he represented. A man of rank. A man of calm defiance. A man who had endured mistreatment without ever raising his voice. Inside Fort Sheridan, the command room buzzed louder than usual. Colonel Mason paced back and forth while 4 analysts patched into servers they weren't supposed to touch. Clearance layers dropped one by one as they tracked the internal leak. Someone at the top had known Daniel's identity would go public. Someone wanted him exposed, but not to support him, to discredit him, to bait him. Mason stopped suddenly and stared at the main screen where the news channels played side by side. One headline read "Public Stands with Silent Hero." Another asked, "Is there a coup inside the military?" He turned to his comms officer. "Give me a direct line to the Pentagon. Level 6 clearance." The officer hesitated. "Sir, that line's locked." Mason's jaw clenched. "Then unlock it." Across the city, Daniel sat alone in a small motel room, lights dim, TV off. He had refused secure lodging from federal agents. He didn't want protection. Not yet. On the table in front of him were files from the warehouse. Photos of victims. Documents signed by names he had once shaken hands with. Evidence so damning it made his fingers twitch with restraint. He had seen betrayal before, but never so carefully arranged. Behind him, the door creaked slightly. No knock. No announcement. Just the creak. Daniel turned slowly, already knowing who it was. The woman in the hoodie stepped inside. Her name was Alira, former interpreter, former ally, now operating under deep cover. She closed the door and locked it with 2 quiet clicks. "They know it was you who leaked the footage," Daniel said. She nodded. They were never going to believe words. They had to see it. He looked at her. She looked older now, not in years, but in burden. The kind of aging that came from too many secrets and not enough nights of sleep. "They're going to come after you," he said. "I'm already a ghost," she replied. "Doesn't matter anymore." He handed her one of the files. She opened it. Inside were names, shipping routes, surveillance footage, and a signed approval from a joint logistics commander stationed overseas. Her mouth tightened as she read. "We're not just talking corruption. This is organized, federal, possibly diplomatic cover." Daniel nodded. "And they buried it under charity missions and border operations. Nobody looked. Nobody asked." Alira leaned against the wall. "So what now? You go public? You give this to the media and hope the right people pay attention?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the window, where morning light barely pierced the dusty blinds. "The media isn't the plan. They only hear noise. I need the people who can't afford to ignore it. Congress, allies abroad, active field agents who've already seen the cracks but needed proof." Alira raised an eyebrow. "And you think they'll listen just because you show up in a wheelchair with a file?" Daniel finally looked at her. "No, they'll listen because I earned stars the hard way. Because I never played politics. Because I bled for a flag they turned into camouflage for their profits. And because I'm not asking anymore. I'm moving." At that moment, her phone vibrated. A secure message. She checked it, eyes narrowing. "Your name just dropped in a classified thread out of Brussels. They're trying to discredit you. Say you went rogue. That your files are fabricated." Daniel didn't flinch. "Then they're scared." "Good." She looked at him again. "You know this ends with one of 2 things. Exposure or elimination." He stood slowly, hands resting firm on the arms of the chair. "Then let's make sure exposure gets there first." Outside the motel, a black SUV idled quietly. Inside, 2 men watched the room through a long lens. "He's still inside. No movement yet." The man in the passenger seat replied without turning. "We wait for the green light. Orders are to observe until confirmed action." Back at the precinct, Jenkins had been suspended. Word had traveled fast. Internal Affairs showed up within hours. The footage had become mandatory viewing in morning briefings. Young officers watched it with wide eyes. Veterans with quiet shame. Some defended him, said he was under stress, said he didn't know. Others stayed silent, because they did know, because they'd walked past too many Daniels themselves. The problem wasn't that he wore a badge. The problem was he wore blindness, and the city had seen it. Downtown, protest signs began to appear. Some carried Daniel's image. Others quoted the moment. He said, "I'm exactly where I need to be." The phrase had become a rallying cry, not just for justice, but for dignity, for visibility, for every ignored voice. Daniel watched none of it. He wasn't doing this for applause. He didn't trust crowds. He trusted consequence. Later that afternoon, a secure call came through his burner phone. The voice was clipped, formal. "NATO inquiry pending. You're being called to testify in Brussels within 72 hours. If you decline, your credibility may be questioned." Daniel answered with only 2 words. "I'll come." Then he ended the call, threw the burner into the toilet, and flushed it. Alira handed him a new one, preloaded with 1 contact. "Mason." The colonel's voice came through immediately. "They've made you a target, but they also opened the gate. You've got 1 shot. After this, they'll close every door." Daniel responded quietly. "Then we break the doors down." Mason sighed. "Just promise me something." "What?" "Don't forget why you came back." Daniel paused, then said, "I didn't." And he meant it. Not once had he forgotten the eyes of that little girl who gave him the chocolate. The boy behind the car. The other Daniel's still out there, too broken to be seen and too dangerous to be heard. He had come back not for redemption, but to remind the system that justice walks even when legs cannot. That authority speaks even when voices are dismissed. And that truth rises not in rage, but in precision. Quiet, patient, inevitable. The private jet touched down in Brussels just after midnight, under a sky so black it seemed to absorb the city lights. Rain coated the tarmac in thin, reflective sheets, and the cold European air cut through the cracks of the fuselage as the doors opened slowly. Daniel sat motionless as aides moved around him, military escorts speaking in hushed tones, briefcases held tight, badges tucked beneath jackets. No red carpet, no press. This wasn't a welcome. It was a warning. The halls of NATO headquarters were quiet when he entered, his wheelchair making soft sounds against the marble floors. The guards at the security gate paused as he approached, their eyes narrowing slightly before a superior officer motioned them to stand down. His presence had been logged, but not publicly acknowledged. Inside the secured chamber, 10 men and women waited. Military officials, intelligence directors, political attaches. Each of them had seen fragments of the leaked footage. Each of them had been briefed, warned, pressured, and now they sat around a long table, waiting to hear the one voice that refused to be erased. Daniel rolled into the room without a word, stopped at the head of the table, and set a folder in front of him. His hand stayed on top of it. He didn't open it. Not yet. The silence hung there, thick and cold. One of the officials finally cleared his throat. "General, we are here to review claims that involve cross-national breaches of protocol, unauthorized operations, and the exposure of high-level internal files. Do you understand the gravity of these accusations?" Daniel looked him directly in the eye. "Do you understand the gravity of what those files contain?" The man stiffened. Another official leaned forward. "You have violated several clearance thresholds. You've operated off the grid, made contact with civilians under false identities, and compromised multiple domestic units." Daniel's voice was calm, because the system meant to enforce the rules was the same system hiding the crimes. You don't expose rot by playing by the rules written by the ones who planted it. A younger woman, British accent, intelligence liaison, asked the next question. "Why now? Why go back into the field after all these years?" Daniel opened the folder. The top photo was of a teenage girl, eyes hollow, arms marked with tracking tattoos, rescued from one of the vans in the warehouse. "Because her face is the same as the ones I saw overseas. Same eyes, same silence. And I was told we had fixed this, that the trafficking, the corruption, the internal leaks were being handled. But they weren't. They were being repackaged." The room stayed quiet. He turned the next page. Photos of crates marked for medical relief, filled instead with weapons and outdated narcotics. These were under direct approval of international task forces, and those documents were signed by men who sit in this very building. Murmurs began. Shifting glances. One official stood. "You're implying treason at the top levels of our allied defense. That's not just dangerous. That's destabilizing." Daniel leaned forward. "What's more destabilizing? A man in a wheelchair asking questions, or a military structure protecting profit over people?" Silence again. But this time something changed. The fear in the room shifted, became calculation. Several of the officials exchanged looks. One of them whispered to another. Then a response. Quiet nods. The man at the far end, French accent, older, finally said, "We've had reason to believe these operations existed, but lacked a credible source inside. Your actions may have violated process, but you've also exposed what no one else could." Daniel said nothing. He didn't need thanks. He needed movement. The woman beside the older man spoke again. "So what do you want from us?" He closed the folder. Official recognition. A task force with oversight. Public acknowledgement that this happened. And full immunity for the whistleblowers who helped bring it to light. The room buzzed. That word, immunity. It meant they had to admit failure. They had to open the door to accountability. It meant risk, but it also meant integrity. The older official nodded once. "You'll have your task force. and your immunity. But there will be questions we can't stop. Politicians will twist this. Media will distort it. Are you prepared to live in the storm you've created? Daniel's eyes didn't flinch. I've lived in storms you'll never understand. Across the ocean, the headlines exploded. General breaks silence. Files confirmed. NATO investigates corruption network. The footage of Daniel rolling out of the building in Brussels went viral in hours. Protesters around the world lifted signs with his face. Veterans groups released open letters of support. Survivors came forward with matching stories. The general had opened a door no one could close. Inside the U.S., government agencies scrambled. An internal audit swept through the Department of Defense. 2 senators resigned. 1 high-ranking logistics officer vanished. Jenkins, now jobless and anonymous, watched from a small apartment as Daniel's face appeared on every screen. He turned off the TV and sat in the dark, haunted not by the fall of others, but by the mirror Daniel had held up to him. A mirror that showed what it looked like to judge without knowing. Across town, Elira sat in a secured safe house, watching the proceedings in Brussels live. When Daniel appeared on screen, she smiled slightly. Not because they had won, but because they had started. Because somewhere between the cracked sidewalks and broken systems, a man in a wheelchair had reminded the world that dignity doesn't wear rank. That justice doesn't require legs to walk. That silence can be a weapon if wielded with truth. And that one man, dismissed and ignored, could still be a general even without a uniform, even without a salute. 3 weeks passed. The headlines had started to cool, shifting from outrage to policy, from revelation to reform. Committees were formed, hearings announced, task forces assembled. Behind the curtain of bureaucracy, change moved slow and cautious, but it moved. And yet, Daniel stayed out of the spotlight. He declined every interview, ignored every offer, refused every invitation to stand behind podiums and speak as a symbol. Because that had never been the point. He had already spoken, with silence, with stillness, with presence. He returned to the city quietly, not to celebrate, but to finish what he started. The warehouse had been cleared, dismantled, sealed. But in its place stood a temporary shelter, a neutral space for those displaced by the operations. Immigrants, veterans, children, forgotten faces slowly remembered. He rolled through the halls, not in uniform, not even introduced by name. Just another man passing through, offering calm to the chaos. A boy in the corner recognized him, not from the news, but from a cold street weeks before. He walked over and sat beside him. Daniel didn't speak. Neither did the boy. They didn't have to. Sometimes recognition wasn't about what was said, but what was felt. Outside, Elira waited by the sidewalk. She nodded once as he exited, handing him a small envelope. Inside was a photo. A young girl from the files, now reunited with her brother in a safe house across the country. He stared at it for a long time. His face didn't change, but something in his shoulders eased, just a little. Elira watched him for a moment, then asked, "So what now?" Daniel turned to the street, where cars passed, and people hurried, and the world spun as if none of it had happened. "Now I disappear again," he said. She smiled, but it wasn't joy. "You were never meant to disappear." He looked at her. That's why it worked. As he moved away, the sky overhead cracked open with soft afternoon rain. Not cold this time. Not cruel. Just quiet. Gentle. A reminder that not all storms come to destroy. Some come to wash away what needed to be seen. Across the city, people still shared the story. Still passed around the clip of the man who had been told to move and chose not to. Some called him a hero. Others called him a ghost. But for those who truly understood, he was something else. He was the proof that power doesn't always wear uniform. That strength doesn't always come with noise. That justice doesn't need a gun, or a badge, or a spotlight. Sometimes it sits in silence, watches, waits, and when the time is right, it rolls forward without fear, without apology, without needing to be believed. Because truth is not about how loud you speak, but how long you are willing to carry it. And as long as injustice hides in daylight, someone like Daniel will be out there, invisible if he has to be, quiet if he must, but unshakable in his mission to remind the world that dignity never begs to be seen. It just refuses to disappear. So if you're still with us now, listening to this story and feeling something shift inside you, let it. Let that fire grow. Let that voice inside whisper louder. And remember, stories like these aren't fiction. They're reflections. They are mirrors. And sometimes, the hero we were waiting for is the one we almost walked past. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something bigger than yourself, we ask that you take a moment to share it. Subscribe to Cracks of Light, not just because we tell stories, but because we believe stories can change the way we see each other. And sometimes, just sometimes, they can change the world.